This morning, I would like to tell you about a musical journey that I have just recently concluded. In April of 2024, I turned 50. Now, often milestone birthdays of this sort will prompt people to strike out on a path of self-discovery or self-reflection. People may come up with a list of 50 or 30 or 40 or whatever the age-appropriate number might be of tasks they would like to accomplish over the next year. Maybe they plan a big trip or an adventure, something of significance to mark the moment. Well, I didn't really feel compelled to do any of those things. But I figured I needed to come up with something that would make the year feel different in some kind of way. And then inspiration hits in the form of an Apple Music playlist, Top Hits of 1974. That playlist served as the soundtrack for a quick getaway to Dripping Springs that Joanna had planned for my birthday. As we listened to all these songs that were released in the year of my birth, I came up with my big idea. I would do a deep dive into 50 albums that were released in the year of 1974. 50 albums to mark 50 years. I decided to give myself 2 weeks to curate my list through careful conversation with friends and neighbors, through emails and texts, to be able to come up with this list based on conversations with people whose musical taste I appreciated and valued. Then I created a listening calendar with one album assigned per week for the next 50 weeks, and then I started listening. My approach was pretty simple. I would give at least 3 concentrated listenings during the week, once on Sunday or Monday, another one on Wednesday, and then again on Friday or Saturday at the end of the week. In addition to those 3 concentrated listening sessions, I would have the album just playing as background music as often as I could, either in the office or in the car or just around the house, so that by the end of the week, I would have spent a lot of time with each one of these albums. Now, one thing that struck me very early on is that while I considered myself very familiar with many of the artists that were on this list, like the Eagles, David Bowie, Joni Mitchell, Billy Joel, Elton John, Willie Nelson, James Taylor, not nobodies. But while I was listening, I was very unfamiliar with many of the songs that I was listening to. It would not be uncommon for me to make my way all the way through an album and have heard maybe one of the songs before. Now, there were some exceptions, like Eric Clapton's 461 Ocean Boulevard, or Linda Ronstadt's Heart Like a Wheel, that were filled with familiar songs. But for the most part, I was getting exposed to music I had never heard before. Now, this wasn't necessarily a surprise, and in fact, it was kind of the point, because one of my motivations in doing this was that I realized that I, like many others maybe from my generation, had been raised on greatest hits albums. Now, in case you're unfamiliar, a greatest hits album is a compilation of an artist's most successful and popular songs put together in a neat, shiny new package. The first greatest hits album was released in 1958 by Johnny Mathis and was simply titled Johnny's Greatest Hits. By the 1970s, greatest hits albums had become a regular part of the musical landscape, so that by the time the 80s roll around, they are in major circulation and have become one of the primary ways that an artist's music is being consumed by a new generation of listeners, like me. Add in multiple format changes that occur over the years, from vinyl to 8-track to cassette to compact disc, and greatest hits compilation become a quick and easy way to get an artist's music without having to repurchase 6 or 7 or 8 albums over and over and over again. Of course, now we've entered the world of streaming, and all bets are off because you can just pick or choose whatever you want to listen to, whenever you want to listen to, however you want to listen to it. But for me, greatest hits albums were a really big deal and were important in shaping my musical taste. Now, greatest hits albums aren't inherently bad. There's nothing wrong with them. But artistically and critically speaking, they're pretty easy to find fault with. Often they're seen as nothing more than a cash grab, just a new way to make money on an old product that you've not put much creative effort into. Some argue these collections will lack depth because they only focus on the chart toppers or the singles. Deep cuts that show more of an artist's range or creativity are often left out and therefore go missed completely. This is known as the real fans take. Some don't like them because they disrupt the flow of the original albums that were often crafted with great care, track order, themes, mood. A greatest hits album just pulls all these things out of context and crams them all together. For others, it's just a simple matter of overexposure. Why do we need a collection of an artist's most overplayed songs that we've all heard a million times? But after my year-long journey through 50 albums, I've come to appreciate that not all songs are created equal. It is true that if your only exposure to an artist is through a greatest hits album or through a curated playlist, you are potentially missing out on a lot of great music. However, it is also true there are some reasons why certain songs last the test of time and others do not. They can't all be greatest hits, and let's face it, sometimes you just need to hear the hits. If you were somehow tasked with trying to create a greatest hits of the Bible, there's a pretty good chance that Psalm 23 is going to make the cut. It's definitely on the short list with maybe a John 3:16, a Philippians 4:13, maybe Jeremiah 29:11 or a Micah 6:8. Passages that people who aren't even that familiar with the Bible have probably heard, or maybe they've at least seen crocheted on a pillow at their grandma's house, or painted on one of those plates at a Cracker Barrel. Whatever the case, it's one of those passages that seems to have just stood the test of time. It's one of those passages that has transcended its own biblical context and entered into the cultural lexicon in a way that few other passages have. It's been quoted in countless movies. It's been used in climactic scenes from Titanic to the John Wayne Western Rooster Cogburn. It's been interpreted into music and song by everyone from Bach to the Grateful Dead. Its themes of comfort and guidance, safety and protection, assurance and provision have resonated with people from generation to generation and probably will continue to do so for generations to come. But I do wonder if we run the risk of thinking we know it too well. I wonder if we have unknowingly begun to tune it out. If we sort of go into autopilot as soon as we hear those opening words, "The Lord is my shepherd." Kind of like the opening riff to Satisfaction. It just doesn't quite hit the same way it once did. I fear these well-known or maybe even well-worn passages run the same risk of becoming maybe cliche or passé, much like those greatest hits collections that I mentioned before. Or maybe we've just become so accustomed to hearing it in a certain way or in such a specific setting that we can't fully appreciate it anymore. And we have trouble letting it mean anything else. I mean, at how many funerals can you hear the 23rd Psalm read before it just gets locked in that context? Sort of like how Seven Nation Army has become just a reason to get a crowd on their feet, you know? Bum, 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 bum. Is it possible that a passage like Psalm 23 has become overplayed or even played out? There's plenty of other passages in the Bible that have gotten less exposure over the years. Maybe it's time to put Psalm 23 to bed and let some of these other passages have their shine. Why should we return to this same passage, this same old ditty that we've heard over and over and over again? Well, to put it simply, some things are worth hearing over and over and over again. There are some things we need to have repeated over and over because we have a tendency to forget. Because we aren't as smart as we think we are, and we don't have things figured out quite as well as we'd like to act like we do. And because we are a lot more like sheep than we want to admit sometimes, wandering off this way and that and getting lost. Because in the same way that sheep never outgrow their need for a shepherd, we never outgrow our need for a God that will continue to guide us and protect us and lead us and provide for us. Because no matter how many times we are told that God will lead us beside still waters, we still find ourselves racked with anxiety. Because no matter how many times we are reminded that God is with us in the darkest of places, there are times where we still feel ourselves paralyzed by fear. Because no matter how many times we are reminded that God will provide all that we need, sometimes we still feel like we don't have enough. We need to return to these words because I'm not sure we really believe them yet. Yes, we need to be challenged by new ideas, new concepts. We need to continue to expand our understanding and grow and change. And the only way to do that is to be introduced to new concepts, new ideas, hear things we've never heard before, be told things we've never been told before. Yes. But we return to the old songs, these greatest hits, because the truth is, they're still great, no matter how many times we may have heard them. And sometimes, just when you least expect it, something new might hit you that you've never heard before or paid attention to. A different word or a different phrase that you hadn't noticed. Maybe a certain word hits your ear differently because the reader put a different emphasis or a different intonation on one of the words. Or maybe the circumstances of your life have changed. And because you are now in a different place, you now hear it in a different way. Maybe this time you hear, "I shall not want," less as a critique of your desire for material things, and more as a call to action. A realization that if God is able to provide for all of your needs, then all of your time and energy and mental space that you might have spent worrying about that can now be spent in pursuit of other things. If you can rest in the knowledge that your shepherd will provide for your needs, how might that free you up to serve your neighbor, or to advocate for the marginalized, or to seek justice in your community? Maybe this time when you hear right paths, it doesn't simply mean doing the right thing versus doing the wrong thing, but rather that God is leading you on the particular path that is right for you, and that your path may look different from somebody else's path. And maybe with that understanding, you're able to give yourself a little grace that the place you find yourself in looks different from the place that your friends find themselves in. Or maybe it allows you to offer grace to someone else whose path is a little bit divergent from yours. And then maybe you give thought to the idea that they are doing their dead level best to follow God's plan for them and God's path for them, even if it may look different than yours. Maybe this time when you hear the psalm read, you pay particular attention to the fact that the pronouns for God change from the third person to the second person. From he leads me, he restores, he makes me lie down, and then a shift to you are with me. Your rod and staff comfort me. You prepare a table. You anoint my head. And in that shift, it hits you that instead of talking about God, the psalmist is now talking to God. This is no longer a theoretical presence, something we think about God, but now it is something that we experience about God. And then maybe you notice that in the very middle of the psalm is when that shift occurs. That the poem is structured in such a way that God exists in the most personal way possible, right in the very center of the psalm. And then you consider that perhaps by structuring it this way, the poet is boldly declaring that God being with us is at the very center of our lives. Or maybe we hear it this time, and instead of thinking about goodness and mercy following us as something that comes along maybe after we've done a certain thing, like a reward, we wonder if goodness and mercy maybe are pursuing us or chasing us or even hunting us down. That maybe God comes after us and will not rest until we experience goodness and mercy. That we are being chased by a God that longs for a relationship with us even when we may be trying to run off in a different direction. Maybe this time when we hear about God's promise of peace and dwelling with God, we put hope in the idea that it is not just something that is reserved for end of life or maybe even the afterlife, but that maybe the promise relates to the here and the now. And maybe we draw a connection to that abundant life, that life to the fullest that Jesus talked about. And we begin to connect the words of the psalmist and the words of Jesus in a way that we hadn't quite done before. So that when Jesus announces himself as the Good Shepherd, he is trying to invoke that very familiar image of the God who walks with us in both the dark valleys and the lush meadows. And maybe we begin to understand that abundant life doesn't mean the absence of difficulties, but rather that we won't be left to face them alone. And maybe the concept of abundant life, which in the past has always somehow been connected to possessions or things or stuff or toys, suddenly changes because you realize that no matter how many of those things you acquire, you still don't feel satisfied. And then maybe it finally clicks that the way to have abundant life is to answer the call to follow Jesus and to simply trust in the one who has promised all along to provide for you. And maybe you wouldn't have thought about that or heard it that way or understood it that way if we hadn't returned to it just one more time. Returned to it because we had the belief or the faith or the hope that God might be trying to reveal something new to us this time. And if that happened this time, then isn't it safe to assume that it could happen again and again and again? Let's face it. Sometimes you just need to hear the hits. Amen.